He died. By every rule, by my words. But today, he's standing in front of me, breathing. The monastery is screaming. Lives are shattering. Calendars are burning. I was certain of every date, every ending. For the first time, silence. For the first time, a mistake. And it has already taken more lives than the truth ever did. If I didn't know this time, then who was I all along? And what happens when they find out? Throw away, because even writing this feels like testing the edge of a blade. I'm a monk, not the romantic kind with stained glass sunlight and wise riddles. I'm the kind with cracked knuckles from splitting wood, ink stains on my thumbs, and a back that stiffens when the bells don't. I took vows at 19, and I've lived behind the same stone walls for most of my adult life. I'm writing this on a borrowed phone in the guest house, because our abbot believes the internet is a sewer, and he's not wrong. But I need a place where people don't already have a story prepared about me. Here's mine, stripped down. People think I know the exact date of everyone's death. Not a sense, not visions, a date. Like it's written on the inside of their skin. Month, day, year, no time, no cause. Just the last day their name belongs to them. I didn't ask for it. I didn't go looking. I didn't drink a potion or see an angel. It started the way most terrible things start. Quietly, and then suddenly, as if it had always been there. I was a novice then, assigned to copy old records in the archive. We keep the monastery's death roll, names of brothers and benefactors, the dates they died, the prayers said for them. It's meant to humble you. It humbled me in the normal way at first. You see how many lives resolve into a line of ink. Then one afternoon, I looked up from the page and saw a date hovering in my mind like an afterimage, attached to Brother Elias as he walked past the door. I blinked, shook my head, looked again. The date stayed. I wrote it down, not because I believed it, but because that's what I do when something won't leave my head. I trap it in ink. Brother Elias died on that date. A simple fall from the bell tower steps. No drama. One second he was laughing about how the soup tasted like boiled socks, and the next second there was blood on the stones that looked too bright to belong in a place where we pray. I told myself it was coincidence. I told myself my brain was looking for patterns because that's what brains do when they're scared of chaos. But the dates kept coming. A lay brother, a visiting priest, a pilgrim who asked for water and collapsed in the courtyard 3 weeks later. At first I kept it secret. Confession is supposed to unburden you, but I didn't want to turn my confessor into an accomplice to madness. Still, it shaped me. It made my prayers hard and exact. It made my fasting feel like a bargain I was trying to strike with someone who wasn't listening. Eventually, someone noticed. People always notice when you flinch at them like they're already a ghost. And when they did, the story built itself around me like ivy around a statue. He knows. God tells him. The monastery has a prophet. The abbot tried to stamp it out, then tried to contain it. Then, after a few too many dates proved correct, he started scheduling private audiences like we were running a clinic. I didn't correct them. That's the first sin in this whole thing, because being certain is a kind of shelter, and I was tired of living in the rain. Once the door opened, it never really closed again. At first, it was just brothers, quiet knocks after Compline, men who had taken vows of obedience and silence, suddenly unable to sit with not knowing. They'd ask in careful language, like they were afraid the question itself might age them. Do you see anything for me? I'd tell myself I was still guessing, still rational, still detached. I'd answer only when the date came uninvited, sharp and undeniable. And it always did. Every time I spoke a date, the world obliged me. Word got out beyond the walls, despite the abbot's attempts to keep things discreet. Villagers came with bread and candles, like it was a transaction. Some knelt. Some stared at me like I was a snake behind glass. I started seeing dates before people even spoke. Mothers holding children too tightly. Old men pretending they weren't hoping for reassurance. Young couples whose hands separated when the numbers appeared in my mind. People did strange things with the knowledge. A man sold his farm because he had plenty of time and wanted to see the sea. A woman stopped treatment because her date was far off and she decided suffering was optional. Another man drank himself to death before his date, convinced that beating fate would prove I was wrong, when his death still landed exactly where I said it would. The story grew teeth. Some people thanked me. That part still haunts me the most. Gratitude like relief, like I'd lifted a weight they'd been carrying since childhood. At least now I can plan, they'd say. As if death were an appointment you could be late for. Others hated me. I was cursed, spat at, called a fraud, a demon, a coward hiding behind robes. One woman screamed that I'd stolen her sleep. She wasn't wrong. There were signs, even then, that something wasn't clean about it. Sometimes the dates came slower. Sometimes they flickered, like my mind was adjusting a lens. I told myself that was humility, that God didn't owe me clarity. Sometimes I saw the same date twice in a day, and it made my stomach turn, because I couldn't tell whose it belonged to yet. I noticed how people changed before their dates. Some grew reckless. Some grew unbearably kind, like they were trying to settle accounts with the universe. A few stopped being themselves entirely, hollowed out by the countdown I'd put in their chest. The abbot asked me once, late at night, if I was sure. I told him yes without hesitation. That was the second sin. Certainty does that to you. It makes doubt feel like betrayal. It makes you edit your own memories to keep the story straight. I began to believe that my job wasn't to question, but to deliver, that I was a messenger, and messengers don't rewrite the message just because the ink frightens them. I didn't see it then, but looking back, I can pinpoint the moment the pattern tightened into a trap. It was when people stopped asking if I knew and started asking why I was taking so long to tell them. Her name was Mara. I'm using her real name because hiding it feels worse now. She wasn't supposed to be there. She wasn't a pilgrim or a believer. She came with her brother, who thought I was a con artist in a robe and wanted proof. He had that aggressive skepticism that's just faith turned inside out. She stood in the back while he argued with the abbot, arms crossed, eyes tired. When I looked at her, the date came instantly, clean, certain. It sat in my mind the way truth always had, unarguable, heavy, final. I told her brother first, thinking I was being merciful. 6 months. That was it. No year-long runway. No poetic symmetry. Just a blunt ending. She didn't cry. She laughed once, sharp and disbelieving, and said, "Figures." Her brother exploded. Called me a parasite. Said I'd killed people with suggestions and superstition. The abbot ended the meeting. Mara lingered long enough to ask me, very calmly, if pain was part of the vision. I told her I didn't see pain. I told her I was sorry. Here's where the story should tighten into inevitability. Here's where the drumbeat I'd come to trust should carry us forward. 6 months passed. The day came. I remember it because I barely slept the night before. I kept telling myself this anxiety was normal, that anticipation didn't imply doubt. I prayed for her soul at dawn like I'd prayed for dozens before her. At noon, her brother called the monastery. Mara was alive. Not barely, not miraculously clinging to breath. Alive. Grocery shopping, complaining about traffic, making plans for dinner. I told myself it was a trick, that he was lying to humiliate me, that there had been a mix-up of dates or names, or that I'd miscounted days like a fool who can't do basic math. Then she came herself. She showed up at the gate just before Vespers, standing in the same posture she'd had months before, except now there was something burning behind her eyes. Not triumph, not relief. Anger. "I took out loans," she said. No greeting. "I quit my job. I said things to people that don't get unsaid. I tried to speak and couldn't. The date was gone. There was nothing there now. No replacement, no correction, just silence." Others gathered. Word spreads faster than truth ever did. Someone shouted that this was a test. Someone else said miracles don't work backwards. The abbot looked older than I'd ever seen him. Mara demanded an explanation. I didn't have one. That was the moment the floor fell away. Not because I'd been wrong, but because I'd been wrong once. Because a single crack was enough to show the whole thing might have been glass. And once people see that, they start pushing. Denial didn't come quietly. It arrived in arguments, in scripture quoted like weapons, in people explaining my own experience back to me as if I were a child who'd misunderstood his homework. Some said Mara was lying. Others said she had died in a spiritual sense, and this was semantics. One man told me God had delayed her death because of her anger, as if spite were a currency heaven accepted. I nodded through all of it because nodding was easier than admitting the truth I couldn't yet shape into words. Mara didn't care about theology. She wanted accountability. People followed her to the guest house. People who'd been building their lives around calendars I'd handed them. A widow who'd sold her house early. A brother who'd refused medical care because his date was fixed. A man whose son had taken his own life 3 weeks before his predicted death, convinced there was no point waiting. That last one didn't yell. He whispered, "Those are the words that stay." I tried to explain uncertainty like it was a recent development, like a storm that had blown in unexpectedly. But the truth leaked out between my sentences. They heard it. They heard that I'd never understood the mechanism, never questioned the source as long as it kept working. The abbot pulled me aside and asked me, very carefully, if I'd ever been wrong before. I told him no. That was the third sin, because as soon as I said it, memories rearranged themselves. Dates that had required reinterpretation. Deaths that landed close enough I'd called them exact. Near misses I dismissed as irrelevant because the person would have died if circumstances hadn't intervened. I'd been generous with myself. Precision is easy when you grade your own exams. Mara demanded I tell everyone their dates were invalid. Others begged me not to. Some clung harder, like this mistake was a fluke that could be sanded smooth if we all pretended together. One brother accused me of cowardice for doubting now. Another accused me of pride for ever believing. Both were right. That night, someone painted a date on my cell door in ash. No name, just numbers. I scrubbed until my hands bled and still smelled smoke. The monastery fractured along lines I hadn't known were there. Faith versus caution, obedience versus conscience, silence versus confession. The thing I'd been most afraid of happened. People stopped asking what was true and started asking what was useful. And in the middle of it all, I realized the worst part wasn't that I might have been wrong. It was that I no longer knew what damage was still moving, set in motion by words I couldn't call back. I didn't sleep for days. When I did, I dreamed in dates, loose numbers drifting like ash, sticking to faces I couldn't recognize. I'd wake up reaching for a pen that wasn't there, heart racing, terrified I'd forget something important, then terrified that I'd remember. I tried to pray. That was worse. Prayer had always been structured for me. Hours, psalms, posture. Even when faith thinned, the scaffolding held. Now every prayer collapsed into the same question, asked 100 different ways. Who gave me this? And worse, why did I never ask? I started replaying everything. The first vision, the early deaths, the gratitude, the rage. I realized how much of my confidence had been relief. Relief that chaos had a shape. Relief that suffering followed a schedule. Relief that my own death, yes, I'd seen my own date too, had felt like a solved problem. That date was gone now. I couldn't see anything anymore. Not for others, not for myself. The silence in my mind was so complete, it felt like hearing loss. Like a sense I'd built my identity around had simply been amputated. Guilt settled in next, heavy and methodical, not the dramatic kind, the inventory kind. Every choice someone made because of me became a weight I carried alone. The treatments refused, the goodbyes rushed, the cruelties excused, the kindnesses delayed. I had turned life into a countdown, and people had trusted me because I wore humility like a uniform. I told myself I'd never forced anyone to listen. That didn't help. Influence doesn't require force, it just requires confidence. The abbot suggested rest, distance, silence. He spoke gently, like someone handling a cracked relic. I could tell he wanted to protect the monastery from me now, and I couldn't blame him. Mara came back once more. She didn't shout this time. She looked tired in a way that made me realize how much of her anger had been fuel, and how empty she must feel without it. I keep waiting for something else to fall apart, she said, like I don't trust being alive again. I had nothing to offer her. No date, no explanation, no absolution. That night I understood something that scared me more than being wrong. I had loved certainty. Not truth, certainty. And without it, I didn't know who I was supposed to be good for. By then, the monastery felt smaller, like the walls had shifted inward while I wasn't looking. People spoke to me carefully, the way you talk to someone who survived something contagious. Some avoided me entirely. Others cornered me with quiet desperation, asking if the silence in my head was temporary, if I thought the dates might come back. I realized they weren't really asking about me. They were asking whether the world was about to regain its rails. The abbot gave me a choice, though it didn't feel like one. I could make a public statement, confess uncertainty, retract everything, let the monastery deal with the fallout. Or I could leave quietly, take the story with me, and let time blur the edges until people found something else to believe in. Both options felt like violence. If I confessed publicly, I would be admitting that I had helped build lives on something I never understood. I would be pulling out a support beam and telling everyone to stand still while the ceiling decided what to do. If I left in silence, I would be confirming the worst suspicions, that I'd known it was a lie and run. When caught, people kept projecting their needs onto me. Believers wanted reassurance. Skeptics wanted an apology. The angry wanted punishment. No one wanted the answer I actually had, which was I don't know. That answer terrifies people more than death ever did. I spent a long night in the chapel alone, not praying so much as sitting in the wreckage of prayer. I thought about vows, obedience, poverty, truth. I'd always assumed truth was a thing you possessed or delivered. I was starting to suspect it might be something you survive. In the end, I chose the smallest, honest thing. I wrote a letter. Not a proclamation, not a defense, a confession, but not the dramatic kind. I said that I no longer claimed any knowledge of death's timing, that whatever had been happening before was gone, and I didn't know why, that people should not make decisions based on words I could no longer stand behind. I didn't explain the past. I didn't justify it. I didn't ask forgiveness. Then I left. No ceremony, no punishment, just a bag, a borrowed coat, and the sound of the gate closing behind me like a punctuation mark. Walking away felt like tearing off a limb I'd grown dependent on. But for the first time since Mara's date passed, the fear shifted. It wasn't about being wrong anymore. It was about what I might do now that no one was telling me the ending. I thought the hardest part would be the loss of faith. I was wrong again. The hardest part was the loss of authority. Out in the world, without stone walls or robes to frame me, I was just another man with a past he didn't know how to summarize. Try explaining a decade of other people's certainty at a bus stop. Try fitting that into a job application. I learned quickly which truths get you labeled unstable and which get you ignored. I took work where no one asked questions, kitchens, warehouses, night shifts where faces blur and no one wants your story. It should have felt like freedom. Instead, it felt like withdrawal. I kept expecting the dates to come back. They didn't, not once. Even in moments when fear would have welcomed them. Especially then. People I met were careless with the future in a way that used to horrify me. They planned vacations years out. They postponed apologies. They assumed tomorrow was theirs by default. I caught myself wanting to warn them. Not with numbers, but with urgency. Don't waste this, I'd think. You don't know how fragile it is. Then I'd remember that neither did I. Mara wrote to me once. A short letter. She'd moved cities. Started therapy. She said she still flinched at calendars, but was learning how to plan again. She didn't forgive me. She didn't curse me either. That felt fair. Sometimes I'd wake convinced I'd forgotten my own death date, like a name on the tip of my tongue. Then I'd realize there was nothing to remember. The relief and the terror came together. Inseparable. I started volunteering at a hospice, of all places. Not as a spiritual guide, as someone to sit and listen. I didn't offer timelines. I didn't pretend meaning was neat. I learned to say, I don't know what happens next, without feeling like I'd failed an exam. Dying people don't need certainty as much as they need company. That was a lesson it took me far too long to learn. Occasionally, someone would recognize me. The story hadn't died, just softened. I'd see the question in their eyes. Do you know mine? And I'd shake my head gently. Some looked disappointed. Some looked relieved. Both reactions made sense. At night, I still wrestled with guilt. Not the sharp kind anymore. The low, constant kind. But there was something else growing alongside it. Humility, maybe. Or just fatigue with pretending the universe owes us explanations. For the first time, my days weren't shaped by endings. They were shaped by small decisions that didn't echo very far. And somehow, that made them heavier and more precious than any date ever had. I used to think people wanted to know their death dates because they were afraid of dying. Now, I think it's because they were afraid of living without a script. Certainty feels generous at first. It gives you a frame. It tells you which risks are safe, which regrets can be postponed, which loves you don't have to fight for yet. But it also robs you quietly. It flattens surprise. It turns courage into calculation. I saw it in hospice more clearly than anywhere else. People who had lived with too much certainty, religious or otherwise, often spent their final days angry that reality hadn't followed the outline they'd memorized. People who admitted they never really knew what they were doing were, oddly, calmer. They asked better questions. I started to recognize my old self in the former, the monk who thought obedience meant accuracy, the man who mistook repetition for truth. Sometimes I wondered if the dates had been real once, if something had brushed against me briefly and moved on, or if I'd built a cathedral on coincidence and confidence. I don't know, and I've stopped trying to close that gap with theories. Not knowing is a discipline now. The world didn't end when I stopped telling people how it would end. It just got louder, messier, more human. I think about the ripple effects still, about how one wrong certainty can travel further than 100 honest doubts, about how easily authority forms around someone who doesn't flinch. If you're reading this hoping for a moral, I don't have a clean one. Just an observation, earned the slow way. Be suspicious of anyone who claims the future with confidence, especially if they seem calm while doing it, especially if they're wearing humility like armor. The most dangerous words I ever spoke weren't dates. They were, I'm sure. Something strange happens when you stop being useful to other people's fears. They stop listening. At first, that felt like punishment. I'd spent so long being a focal point, an oracle, a warning. warning sign, a calendar with a pulse. That invisibility felt like erasure. I'd walk past conversations where death was discussed casually, philosophically, even jokingly, and no one would glance at me to see if I reacted. No one waited for my face to tighten. Then, slowly, I realized that this was the first honest silence I'd had in years. In the monastery, even quiet had been loaded. Silence meant expectation, meaning, God maybe. Out here, silence was just absence. A bench at dusk, a room after someone falls asleep, breath without interpretation. I noticed how much of my former compassion had been distorted by certainty. When you think you know the ending, it's easy to rush the middle, to confuse acceptance with detachment. I told myself I was helping people prepare, but often I'd been helping myself avoid sitting with their terror. Now, when someone talked about fear, of death, of meaninglessness, of wasting their life, I didn't reach for answers. I stayed. That was new, uncomfortable, honest. There were days I wanted the numbers back, not for power, for reassurance, for the relief of thinking that at least someone had a plan. But the longer they stayed gone, the more I understood that what I'd called certainty had been a shortcut around responsibility. If the end is fixed, then urgency is optional. If the end is known, then the present becomes a waiting room. Living without that knowledge means every day demands a choice, not a dramatic one. Just the steady, exhausting work of deciding who you are when no one is counting down for you. I still feel the weight of what I did. I don't think that ever fully lifts. Some nights I imagine the people whose lives bent around my words, and I accept that I don't get to rebalance that scale. Accountability isn't always symmetrical, but I've learned this. Guilt that leads to silence is just pride in mourning clothes. Guilt that leads to presence, imperfect, unqualified presence, is something else. Something closer to repentance. I don't know if I was ever chosen for anything. I only know that losing certainty forced me to become someone who listens longer than he speaks. And that has changed the shape of my days more than any date ever did. This will be the last thing I write about this. Not because it's resolved, but because I don't want it to calcify into another identity. If you think you know how the world truly works, really know it, down to the endings, I want you to pause. Not forever, just long enough to ask what that knowledge is protecting you from feeling. Certainty is seductive because it feels like safety. But safety isn't the same as truth, and it's definitely not the same as love. Love requires risk. Presence requires not knowing what comes next. I used to believe faith meant trusting the map. Now I think it might mean walking without one and resisting the urge to draw fake landmarks just to calm yourself down. The most devastating moment of my life wasn't being wrong. It was realizing how many people had handed me their fear because I spoke without hesitation. If you ever meet someone like the man I was, someone who claims access to the future, to fate, to God's filing cabinet, watch how quickly they answer. Watch how rarely they doubt out loud. Ask yourself who benefits from that confidence. As for me, I don't know when I'll die. And for the first time, I think that ignorance might be a gift. Not because it makes me brave, but because it makes me careful with the time I'm given. If there's anything I've learned, it's this. A life isn't measured by how accurately you predict its end. It's measured by how gently you treat the days you can't control.